Okay, great. All right, well, welcome everybody and good afternoon. I'm Jennifer Renner and here joined with my Project Arise colleagues, Nicole Matthew and Matt Bordalio. And on behalf of Project Arise, we are just thrilled that you are here today. And whether or not you are joining us for the first time or perhaps you're returning from session 1 and 2, we are really glad that you are here today. So Project Arise offers professional learning opportunities for TK through 12 educators across the state of California, and we are funded through the Reading Instruction and Intervention Grant from the CDE. And our goal is really to elevate inclusive, effective reading instruction for every learner. And we are so fortunate that we have all these amazing county partners across the state, as well as content partners who help us develop and deliver our professional learning. And we are joined here today from the National Center on Intensive Intervention with John Potter. And just a quick reminder, we just want to make sure you're all aware and have taken advantage of the free self-paced online courses offered by Project Arise. And these courses offer a comprehensive approach to literacy instruction and can be taken in any order to meet your needs. So wherever your interest lies. And then we also, if you need graduate semester units, you can also earn those from completing the courses. You're going to have Matt drop in the link if you're interested in signing up on California Educators Together. That's where our courses live. Thanks, Matt. All right. And then we still have quite several professional learning opportunities still available. So there is a link to some additional learning opportunities that you can choose from. And finally, we just wanted to let you know that we will follow this email for those of you that are new today. We do follow these webinar series with a one-page document where you'll find key learnings, session slides, as well as recordings to go back to. So we'll follow up with that tomorrow. And finally, it is time for us to turn it over to Dr. John Potter. We are thrilled to have him here today and have him just really bring this nice and clear for us. What are we gonna do with this data that we're collecting from RDRS? So thank you, John, for joining us today. I'm gonna stop sharing and turn it over to John.
All right. Is my screen showing up? Good.
Yep.
All right. Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to be here with you all this afternoon. I'm going to preface today by just saying I am getting over a cold. So the joy of having a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old is they get sick a lot, and they get sick for a couple of days. I get sick for weeks. But mine is almost done. I am almost over it. But I have a cup of tea here, and I should be okay. But if I have to mute for a second, that's why. But glad to be here with you all today. If you've attended the other 3 sessions, thanks for coming back for the third session. I feel like this is kind of the big payoff today because we're going to talk about kind of what do we do with the screening data, right? Which is what we all want to know is how do we use the data to impact outcomes for kids? So that's what we'll be diving into today, and it is a fairly meaty session today. So I know these are being recorded. This one may be one that you want to go back to and kind of take a look at the slides and maybe listen to it, or at least keep parts of it again, because there's a lot in here today. Um, so again, my name is John Potter. So I'm currently located in Portland, Oregon, so just north of you all. That's my background. I approach this work really from the lens of school psychology and special education, and how do we support our students with the most intensive needs. And so prior to my current position with the National Center on Intensive Intervention, I worked for a number of years as a statewide MTSS coach in Oregon, building primarily early literacy multi-tiered systems, also some secondary systems as well. So you can kind of see my experience and my area of interest there. Um, so right now, I'm coming to you as a kind of representative of the National Center on Intensive Intervention. If you haven't checked us out yet, please do. You can just Google NCII and it'll show up. But we are an organization that is federally funded through the Office of Special Education Programs to really support educators at all levels to make sure that we are supporting kids with the most intensive needs. So how do we provide intensive intervention for students that need it most? and I'll talk a little bit about this process of DBI or database individualization. That is our kind of way that we provide intensive intervention for students with intensive needs. So as we're kind of getting in the room here, just want to give an opportunity for everyone, um, to kind of introduce yourself in the chat here. Realize this just popped up. Hang on a second. There we go. Um, no, that keeps wanting to pop up. Hang on a second. I'm gonna stop sharing for a second here. Let me do this while I'm talking here. There we go. That should hopefully take care of that. Okay. Let me restart this. A little bit of technical problems today. All right, there we go. That should fix it. Let's try this. There we go. All right. So our kind of icebreaker welcome in today in the chat. If you just want to put in your name and role, where you're coming to us from today, and kind of a simple question for everyone. 'Tis the season for pumpkin spice. So, are you a yay or nay for pumpkin spice? And I will preface that by saying I am very much a yay. I am pro pumpkin spice, pretty much anything. So we got a yay, we got a no. That's okay. Oh, no, a heavy no from Carla. All right. Hannah, you are like my wife. I am team pumpkin spice. She is team peppermint, for sure. That is where she is on. Nay, pumpkin spice. Oh, there's a whole lot of no's to pumpkin spice. All right. Team maple. Okay. Not in coffee. That's fair. All right. All right. I think I'm outnumbered here. The yays are outnumbered, but that's okay. I am proud team pumpkin spice. So. All right. Well, again, welcome to you all. Glad to have you in here today with us. So, as we go through today, just a few kind of housekeeping things. The materials are available, and I know you'll get a link to the materials as well, but you can also access it through this tiny URL that I set up. Basically, it's just a Google Drive, and I'll drop it in the chat here. Um, Oops, there we go. Just a Google Drive with materials, the slides for each of the sessions. You can go and kind of access those as you like. But as we kind of talk today, you will get opportunities to participate in activities, answer questions through the chat. Would love to have you use the chat box to do that, to participate in activities, and also to ask questions. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Hopefully, we'll have a little bit of time at the end, but if I do see questions in there, I can address those as we go as well. So feel free to drop those in the chat as well. All right. And I will say, not required because it's the end of the day, but love to see cameras on if you can. Love to see faces. Just as you all know, if you've ever done a Zoom meeting or presented a Zoom meeting, sometimes it feels like you're just talking at a blank screen, and it can be a little upsetting. So it's nice to see actual faces of people. But I also recognize you may not want to put your camera on, and that is okay too. All right. So this is the webinar series that we've had. So if you haven't attended each of the first two, these are the topics. So at session one, we talked about just general purpose of screeners, what they are, what they're not, and some mindsets behind, how do we make sure that we're using them appropriately. Session two was more kind of logistics. How do we collect quality data and make sure that we're, getting data that we can use? Because if we're not collecting reliable, valid data in a consistent way, it's really hard to make decisions. So we want to make sure that we're collecting those appropriately. And then today we're going to talk about what do we do with that data. So our objectives for today, kind of straightforward. We're really going to focus on how do we look at screening data to do a couple different things. How do we use it to evaluate and strengthen tier one? So what do we do to look at our RDRS data to support all learners at tier one, but also how do we use it to identify students in need of tier two or tier three interventions, and how do we support students with the right interventions with that screening data? So screening data has a couple multiple different uses for it that could be quite effective. So, and we'll also wrap up by talking a little bit about how do we make sure that we're communicating this with families, and I'll share a couple resources from NCII that might help with that. So what to expect today, just in general, I like to share this at a lot of my sessions at the beginning. Just expect that some of the information you're going to hear today is going to be new, hopefully. Like we want you to come and learn something. So hopefully you're going to learn something new that you can take back. But also, be aware that some of the information you hear should be review. And that's a good thing, right? Like you want to be affirmed in the good work that you're already doing. So you're going to hear some things and going to say, yes, we're on the right track or we're doing that. And that's a good thing. You do want to hear things that are review. And then some information may be challenging for you. Just you may need to think about it a little bit. Maybe you hear something in a different way that you hadn't heard before, something that you just kind of need to chew on for a little bit. And that's okay too. So just be aware, like it's going to be kind of a mix of different things for you. And I hope to provide something new, something review, and something challenging for each and every one of you. All right. So I talked about at the beginning, National Center on Intensive Intervention. We are an organization that is focused on supporting students with the most intensive needs, and that's done through this process called DBI, or data-based individualization. And so, what is DBI? So, DBI is a evidence-based process. So, there's a lot of research behind the components and the use of this framework for improving student outcomes. But it's a process for supporting students with the most intensive needs. So, how do we provide interventions, and then how do we adapt those interventions when they're not working to make sure that we're improving outcomes for our students that need it the most? So, it integrates practices, programs, assessments, strategies, database decision-making models, but it integrates a lot of different things. And so it's 5 steps. And as I talk through these, I would not be surprised that many of you, if not most of you, are using some of these steps already. So it's kind of a way of just pulling a lot of things that people are doing together in a pretty consistent framework. And so at the top there, you see that first step is really this idea of having a validated intervention program that's delivered with fidelity. And we'll talk a little bit about like a tier 2 intervention, what that might look like. But the idea is we start with some intervention for a student. So a student needs additional support, has intensive needs. We want to start with some sort of validated intervention program and do that in a way that's consistent. When we do that, we also progress monitor our students. So we're talking about screening today, but the idea is when we deliver interventions, we don't just want to wait to the next screening period to make sure students are making progress, but we want to progress monitor a little bit more frequently. So that may be every other week, that may be weekly. Typically for students with the most intensive needs, we want to progress monitor weekly for those students, especially in early literacy. So we deliver a program, we progress monitor, and sometimes we find that students are responsive to that. We're just going to continue that program. But if students are not responsive and we find that they're not making the progress that we want to see, we would collect and use diagnostic data to help us develop a hypothesis around why is that student not being successful? Why are our intervention supports not working in the way that we want them to for this student? So we collect some diagnostic data and we use that to adapt an intervention. We use that to change an intervention in some way. And the reason we do this hypothesis, we collect data to do that, is that we don't just want to be like throwing solutions at a student. We want to make sure that we're implementing something that has a high likelihood of being effective because we've collected some data to say they're probably not making progress because of this or because we're missing this, whatever that is. And so we use that data to adapt the intervention to hopefully something that's going to be more effective. And then we continue to progress monitor students to see how effective those adaptations are. And then we continue that process. If it still isn't working, we continue to collect more data and adapt as needed. And so as we think about, like today, we're talking about screening, where does screening fit in this whole process? And screening really can be thought of as it's the entry point into this. It's that really standardized, objective way of identifying who are those students that are going to need a validated intervention program. So moving beyond like relying on teacher referral, just like if the teacher refers them, they may get support. If the teacher doesn't refer them, they won't. But using a evidence-based, more objective screening process to identify kids early who are going to need support, who are at risk of not meeting future reading benchmarks and becoming proficient, and providing interventions so we can prevent future reading difficulties before they occur. And that's really the goal, right, of the RDRS, that early literacy screening to make sure that we're identifying kids early on who are going to need some more intensive supports. Right. So we talked about this at the last session, but the idea is, we talk about 3 steps with screening is that, we select it, we collect it, and we use it. So the first step is we're selecting what is our screening tool that we're using, and you all have 4 wonderful tools to choose from in terms of the RDRS, and I'm realizing you also have other screening measures that you may be using as well. But we select that screener. We have a process for collecting that and making sure that we're doing that in a consistent, reliable, valid way. And then we want to use that screening data. And that's what we're going to talk about today is how do we use that screening data. So, real quick, as we revisit the purpose of screening before we dive into how it gets used, is when I talk about screening, I use this analogy a lot of a medical analogy. In that, whenever we go to the doctor, right, every year you go for your annual checkup or should, you're going to get some typical screening. Procedures done, right? You're going to get your blood pressure, you're going to get your temperature, they're going to weigh you, they're going to maybe do some blood work. Those are all real quick assessments that are going to help determine are you on track to be healthy or do we need to look at some additional follow-up testing or treatment for you. And so screening is the same way. It's that way to check in regularly with all students to see who are those kids who are at risk of later reading difficulties. Because the idea is we don't want to wait till students are struggling with reading. We want to identify them early so we can prevent significant future reading problems. Because what we know of literacy instruction in general is when we do intervene early with students, we have a high likelihood of preventing reading difficulties. But when we wait until students get into middle elementary, upper elementary, and especially middle and high school, like the outcomes are not quite as good. It's not to say we can't remediate future reading difficulties, but the resources and challenge become a lot more difficult to do so. So we want to spot kids early that we can do something and prevent that. So we use screening data to provide interventions to students who identify as at risk. And we also use student screening data to identify patterns across our tier one. So we can start to see, like, for example, if a doctor is seeing that everyone is coming in with high blood pressure, or everyone is coming in with a certain condition, like there's something environmentally or something else going on that's causing that we may need to look at some prevention measures like in our tier one medical and health practices. And so same way with screening. If all our kids are at risk for reading difficulties, we know that we need to do something different in tier one. And so we talk about this, like using the screening data within this idea of MTSS, a multi-tiered system of support. And I like to say, if you're doing a presentation on MTSS, I think you're legally obligated to, show a triangle. This is ours, so we've met our quota. But the idea is, as we think about these tiers of support, and we show the triangle like this, perhaps you've seen it like this, but that they're layered on top of each other. They don't take the place of the different tiers. So, for example, if I'm receiving this tier two support in this yellow range, additional interventions, I don't not receive tier one. Everyone receives tier one, but they're layered on top of each other. And so the idea is we have tier one or universal level of prevention provided to all students. The goal is that it's provided to all students and it is sufficient for most students. So we wanted to meet the needs of 80% of students. And so in early literacy, really what that looks like is 90 minutes or maybe 120 minutes of a tier one reading program that is evidence-based, that uses based on the science of reading and delivers all of those features of reading from the word reading, decoding strand, and the oral language vocabulary comprehension strand as well. So that's provided to all kids, and then for some kids, they're going to need more. Like you could be providing the best reading instruction that is possible, and you're still probably going to have some kids that are going to need some more because 90 minutes, 120 minutes just won't meet the needs of all kids for a number of reasons. And so that's why we have this tier two level of supports provided to some of our students, ideally around 10 to 15% who need a little bit more. And then we have this tier three intensive level of supports that are going to be provided to a few students that are going to need the highest level of support. And so the idea is screening data identifies who needs what level of support. And so as we look at the triangle, like the triangle really represents levels of support, not students, right? There's no tier one students, there's no tier two students, there's no tier three students. Those describe the level of support. There are students who need a tier two level of support, students who need a tier three level of support, but that is done through screening to start to identify who are those students, right? So now I want to talk a little bit about how we kind of use this data to identify, to support students in need of intervention as well as at the tier one level. And so when we think about the first purpose I'm going to talk about is how do we identify the level of risk for a student and how do we kind of match them to an intervention that's going to be appropriate or has a high likelihood of being successful. And so here's an example of what some screening data might look like. And this may look similar to what you collect. This is based on like Dibble's 8th edition. So if you're using M-Class, you should have something similar. But the idea is each of these screeners is going to have multiple subtests or curriculum-based measures that they're going to administer. And so we have like a LNF would be a letter naming fluency, PSF would be a phoneme segmentation fluency, a nonsense word fluency with correct letter sounds, nonsense word fluency with words recoded correctly, a word reading fluency, all the way to oral reading fluency. And so the idea is on each of those subtests, like we identify our kids at some risk, at no risk, or at high risk. Um, and so we can start to look like what level of support they need in each of these skills. But overall, what those assessments are also going to do is they're going to give you something like this, a composite score or some overall indicator of risk. And so that's done because we know that reading is it's not a singular thing, right? It contains multiple skills. And so sometimes kids may not be as good at some skills as they are as other skills, but the idea is we're looking across a range of skills and we start to see what is the overall risk of our students in terms of we know students who fall in a specific range of pattern of scoring on these assessments typically don't meet future benchmarks unless we provide intensive intervention. And so we use that composite score to start to identify when I say who's at risk of needing an intensive intervention or a tier two intervention, that composite or overall score is going to be the way to identify what that is. Whereas all of these individual measures here are going to be more individual skill measures that diagnostically a little bit we'll talk about can start to guide you in like what are the skills that we start to need to intervene on. So we use the composite or overall score to say who is at risk, and we use those individual skill measures to start to dig a little bit deeper and see, well, what do we do next? And so once we've identified risk, then, say we've given our screening and we've identified that a student comes up as at risk, what do we do now? And your state gives very good guidance in terms of what are the next steps. So they give these five things here. So ranges from providing evidence-based literacy instruction, progress monitoring, early intervention, small group tutoring, further diagnostic assessment. Those are all components of this DBI process, this database individualization process. So from that intervention, progress monitoring, diagnostic data, those are all things, if you're implementing DBI, they would all meet the needs of the state criteria for what you need to do to follow up with students with intensive or that show up as at risk on your RDRS measure, right? So with that, then we know the good starting place that if we have a student that is identified as at risk is we need to provide some level of intervention for those students. And so we want to start with this validated intervention, which is step one of this DBI process. And so what are the features that we're looking for in an evidence-based intervention? So it's a few things. And so we think about first and foremost, we want them to be hopefully a standardized evidence-based program or instructional practice. So basically something that has some evidence that it's going to be effective. Um, because if we're just throwing things at kids, we're designing our own interventions, there's chance that those might work. Sometimes they do, but we want something that's been tested with a large number of students to say when we implement this with fidelity, that is generally going to be effective. So we start with some standardized evidence-based programs or instructional practices. I know we don't always have programs available to us, but we want to hopefully have some programs. If not, we know we're using the most evidence-based practices for students. Um, they're also targeted to a specific skill or set of skills, and I'm going to talk through how to use your screening data to kind of look at that. But we know kids who need reading intervention don't all need the same thing. There are a wide range of reading interventions that target different skills. And so when we start with a validated program, we want to target it to the specific skills that we're seeing a student is needing, and screening data can help you do that. We want it to match to their student needs or the function of their behavior. So targeted and match basically means that we're working on a few specific things, and those few specific things are matched to what they specifically need. And then the last one is that we deliver it with fidelity. We use the practice as intended because that's the way it was tested and researched. And so these would all be features of validated intervention programs. And we get asked often, Why do we need to start with a standardized evidence-based intervention program or practice? Why can't we just kind of create our own thing and go with that? And there's a few reasons for that. And so the first reason is that, first and foremost, they're effective. Research will say if you use an evidence-based intervention that is matched to student need, they typically meet the needs of most kids that receive them. So if I give a phonemic awareness intervention as a high evidence base to students that have a phonemic awareness issue, you're going to meet the needs of most of those students. And they're not going to require additional intervention. And so, first and foremost, they typically work. Now, not all the time. There's no program that works all the time, but these are going to work most of the time when they're matched to need. Um, but they're also efficient. If you've ever tried to like plan reading intervention for each individual student, that can be very time consuming. That can be, looking for materials, resources, figuring out how to like put together a scope and sequence. That's a lot of work and effort for a teacher to do. And so we want teachers to plan for groups of students by delivering evidence-based programs rather than individualize for each and every student. There are some students that you're going to need to individualize for, but we want to start with a solution that has a high likelihood of working. So we want to do this efficiency piece first by implementing a group intervention. So they're effective, they're efficient, and they're consistent. And so we know that these can be replicated across teachers, across classrooms, across schools. This idea that you're going to get a consistent intervention, and it's not going to depend on the teacher per se. And so, if we're individualizing for everything and putting it on the teacher to design their own interventions, you're going to have some teachers that are going to be able to do that really well. You're going to have some teachers that are not going to be able to do that really well. And we want some level of consistency for our students. And so that's why we want to start with evidence-based intervention programs. And so with evidence-based intervention programs, I mentioned this before though, they're only effective when they are matched to the specific need. So it's important that we find the right intervention for a student. Now, again, not going to work 100% of the time, but they should work most of the time if we match them to need. And I want to go back to this idea of like this medical analogy that I use because there's a lot of overlap between the public health model, medical model, and like a multi-tiered system of support. They're basically both based on the same kind of framework. But the idea is when we go to seek medical treatment is effective when it is matched to the condition that is treating. And so I'll use the example of antibiotics. Antibiotics is a very effective treatment for a bacterial infection. So my son, my 3-year-old went in just like 4 or 5 months ago. He had all the symptoms of an ear infection. Doctor looked in his ear. Yep, you've got an ear infection. You're going to get some antibiotics. You're going to take that for 10 days, and that's going to clear up your ear infection. Great. That's a perfect treatment for an ear infection. But antibiotics is not an effective treatment for a viral infection. If he just came in with the flu or a common cold, that is not an effective treatment. And in many cases, that can actually do harm because we know like antibiotics can be harsh on your stomach. We also know as people take antibiotics more, like we build up we get things that have resistance to antibiotics, and so we don't want to give antibiotics to someone that's got a viral infection. Similarly, physical therapy and pain relievers. Great treatment for a muscle injury. That's going to be like step one. If you go in with a muscle injury, that's typically what they're going to prescribe, unless like it's pretty significant to need surgery. That's a good like tier 2 intervention. But it's not a good intervention for asthma, right? Like for asthma, you're going to need to know what sets it off. You're going to want to take an inhaler. Like there's different treatment for different conditions. And so the idea is like good treatments are great. Like antibiotics are great. Physical therapy, pain relievers are great, but they're only great when they're matched to the specific treatment. So the idea is we match the treatment to the condition. And so when we talk about educational interventions, it's the exact same philosophy. And so we think about like a reading fluency intervention, having students do repeated readings, partner readings, practice the same reading over and over, building fluency at the word level, at the phrase level, at the sentence level, at the passage level. That is a great intervention, a treatment for kids that are slow but very accurate readers. So those kids that kind of read very slowly and they just need practice, but they're accurate. They know all the words, they can decode them, but they need to build up fluency. A reading fluency intervention is not an effective treatment for students with low decoding skills. If kids cannot decode the words on the page, a fluency intervention is going to teach them to make errors really quickly because they can't read those words. And so we do not want to give a fluency intervention to a student that can't decode the words. Now, fluency can be some additional practice, but we have to get kids accurate before we can expect them to be fluent. Similarly, something like an advanced phonics intervention. So, a phonics intervention is teaching things like multisyllabic words, prefixes, suffixes. That's great for students that have multisyllabic word difficulties. It's not great for kids that don't know letter sounds, like because that's going to be way far beyond their skills and they're not going to do well in that. And so again, like all of these are great interventions, but they're great interventions when they're matched to the specific needs of the students that we're providing them to. We don't want to have a mismatch because then it's not likely to work. And so we want to match the intervention to the instructional needs, similarly to how we're matching the treatment to the condition in the medical analogy. And so then the question becomes, how do we identify that instructional need? Because that's what this is all wrapped up around. We want to know instructionally, what does the student need? And it goes back to data, right? Like we want to use the data to identify what students specifically need. And so we start with the screening data to do that. We may need some additional diagnostic data to do that, but with your RDRS measures specifically, there is a ton of information in there that you can use diagnostically to start to match kids to an appropriate intervention. And so you think about all those screener subtests that you give on your RDRS. And so you think of things like phoneme segmentation fluency. It's a measure of phonemic awareness where the instructional need is kids who can't do that don't know how to take words apart, listen to words and take them apart, segment phonemes. Phonics, we have nonsense word fluency. We have looking at correct letter sounds. Can kids identify basic letter sounds? Can they blend CVC words? All the way up to, if we look at oral reading fluency, kids who can read accurately, that's a measure of phonics. Kids who are not reading accurately typically have some level of phonics issues. And so the idea is all of these measures are curriculum-based measures or CBMs. And CBMs were created, back in the 1960s and 70s. They've been around for a very long time. And these measures were specifically designed because they were in response to, at the time, educational testing was not particularly matched to instruction. We had these long tests that like a school psychologist or someone came in to give that had kids look at pictures, had kids like predict things, but what it didn't have is kids wouldn't read. Like they wouldn't just sit down and like read or look at letters and like so these CBM measures were designed to be very quick 1 minute 2 minute measures that measure specific skills that we know are predictive of reading. We know kids who can identify letter sounds then can start to blend those together, then can start to read sentences, then can start to read passages, right? And so we can use these individual CBM measures to start to identify, well, what is the instructional need for students? And so the idea is we want to have some clear decision rules at our school, at our district, to help guide teachers in creating a clear path from data to an intervention program. And so the idea is we want to have a pathway that says students who have this pattern of data have this instructional need, and we will respond to that by providing this intervention program. That takes the guesswork out of it for teachers, so they don't have to always like think about what they need to do for each individual student. But it's a decision guide to say, if we see this, then we are going to respond in this way. And so let me share some examples of what that might look like. And so when you think about early literacy, we could think about if we have a student that shows up on our RDRS and we're finding low phoneme segmentation fluency, so they're not able to break apart orally spoken words, low nonsense word fluency, so they don't know letter sounds, they can't blend those together, and low oral reading fluency. They don't read accurately, they don't read fluency. So a student who can't perform at benchmark on any of these assessments is typically going to have an instructional need at that very basic level of phonemic awareness and basic phonics, right? They need to know letter sounds. They need to know just the sounds of language in general and how that maps on to the written letters. And so we might say, well, we are going to address that by providing phonemic awareness and phonics program X. whatever it is. Like we have a program that addresses these. And it may not be just one program. You may have a few programs, especially like in a larger district. You may create a menu of like, here's a couple things because not all the schools have the exact same thing. But we want to be consistent in terms of how we're responding. So I know if I go to this school, if I go to that school, I'm going to get something similar. Now, what I would discourage you from, though, is you can have a couple programs that maybe serve this instructional need, but you don't need like six, seven, eight, nine, 10 programs that do the same thing, because you can't train all that, you can't support all that. It won't be consistent and it will become unmanageable. So get a few programs that meet each of the instructional needs. So let's try another one. Um, so conversely, if we have a student that shows this pattern of data, so we've got high phoneme segmentation fluency, so they can segment oral words, they can break them apart. If I tell them to tell me all the sounds in the word stop, and they go ah, they can do that. They can do it automatically and fluently. Great. They can segment phonemes. High nonsense word fluency, so they know letter sounds. They can blend those letter sounds into basic words. They do well on that. High oral reading fluency accuracy. So they are accurate, very highly accurate, above 96, 97% accurate. They read all the words correctly, but they are low in fluency. They don't do that very quickly. It's not automatic for them. They get them all correct, but they're real slow. They're almost like decoding every single word. Like a student like that, they need to work on fluency. Like that decoding piece is there, but they need practice with it. They need to, practice putting words together into phrases, phrases together into sentences, sentences together into, paragraphs. And we will respond to that by providing this reading fluency program. Again, whatever it is, there's many out there that are good, or just a repeated reading strategy. Like fluency is kind of an easier one. Like repeated readings is generally the most effective way to build fluency in a structured way. But the idea is, again, that's a different intervention that we're going to provide than for that first student, like because they have a very different instructional need, and we want to provide some guidance for our teachers to be able to identify that. All right. So I want to have you kind of chime in here and practice one of these. So I'm going to give you a couple options. I want you to choose which one you think is more appropriate. And so say we've got a student that shows up like this on their data. So high phoneme segmentation fluency. So phonemic awareness seems pretty established. High nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds. So they know all their letter sounds. They can do that automatically, but they are low in nonsense word fluency, words recoded correctly. So they know all the letter sounds, but they can't blend those letter sounds together. And they're low in oraling fluency. So they don't read accurately, they don't read fluently. So they're somewhere in between this, going from the letter sound to blending into simple words. That seems to be where they're at. And so, is their instructional need phonemic awareness and basic letter sounds, or is their immediate instructional need phonics and basic decoding? So, would it be that PA and letter sounds, or would we want to do basic decoding with that student? Where are they at? Yes, we got a phonics, basic decoding. A couple more answers. Phonics basic code. Yeah. Yes. Yep. Right on. So yes. Phonemic awareness of letter sounds, we do not need to intervene on that because that is established, but this student needs practice with basic decoding of starting to put those together. So you've got a couple different programs that might teach these. Maybe it's the same program that teaches these things, but it's different placement. One's more advanced, one's a more basic level. But the idea is we would put them in this phonics basic decoding intervention if we saw that pattern of data. All right, one more. What if you got a student who has low oral reading fluency, accuracy, so they're not an accurate reader. So this is probably like a more of a second grader-ish. Not an accurate reader, not a fluent reader, and struggles with comprehension. So would this student's instructional need be decoding and phonics, or would we want to start by providing a reading comprehension intervention? Which one would we want to prioritize for this student? Yeah, decoding phonics, decoding phonics. Yeah, phonics. Yep. Right on. Yes, this is a student we want to provide phonics because they're not reading accurately. They do not know how to decode the words well enough to be able to understand. So, reading comprehension is probably not established in the student because they can't access the words on the page. And Anita Archer says it best when she always says there is no comprehension and strategy in the world that's going to overcome a student who simply cannot read the words. And so, not to say we're not like still engaging in comprehension and vocabulary building activities through tier one instruction. You absolutely still do that with these students. They should be accessing grade level text and talking about that. But this student needs some phonics and decoding work so they can start to lift the words off the page. And that will help the comprehension, right? Like kids who can read will understand better. Still need comprehension, vocabulary support, but phonics and decoding is really going to support those students. All right. So that's kind of the basic idea. And then the idea is you want to develop, we call it a placement protocol. Maybe you have another, word for it. I've seen flow charts that kind of draw this out. I've seen it called like a matching matrix. But the idea is you want to have some guidance, some specific decision rules for your school, for your district that helps guide when we see this instructional need, this is how we respond. And so, for example, as we talked about it, if we've got this student that is below benchmark in phoneme segmentation fluency, nonsense word fluency, oral reading fluency, they're below benchmark across the board. Their instructional need is phonemic awareness, and we will respond by providing this phonemic awareness intervention. When we have a student that is above benchmark in phoneme segmentation fluency, but below benchmark on all the other measures, different instructional need, right? They need basic work on identifying letter sounds because this seems to be where the breakdown is occurring. And so we would intervene by providing this basic phonics intervention program, whatever it is. And so the idea is we continue to build that for all of the patterns that we're going to see in our data across that RDRS. It's going to be a different pattern and a different instructional need. And so these students they've got the letter sounds down, but they don't blend them. And so they need basic decoding. And so we've got a different phonics intervention, or it's differently placed in the phonics intervention. For our students that, basic phonics seems to be great, but they seem to struggle with like reading in text. Then we want them decoding in connected text. So maybe it's a more advanced phonics program with some fluency built in there. All the way up to a student who can read accurately but not fluently, we have a fluency intervention. And there may be more like patterns on here as well. Like you may have oral language screening included in your screener. That was a piece that you would want to add into this. But this just provides an example of how you might look at that data to start to identify some decision rules for students that need intervention and which intervention they need. The one piece I would also add here is you may want some additional diagnostic assessment to dig a little bit deeper. For example, if I'm finding like a student, needs to work on basic decoding, there's a range of where kids are at. And so we may use something like a phonics survey, a phonics inventory to dig a little bit deeper. Many of the really good evidence-based programs have placement tests or phonics like surveys in them that you can use to help place students in that program. If you do have an evidence-based program, I typically tell people start with that like placement test as your primary diagnostic because that's going to tell you within the program, okay, this student needs to be plugged in here versus this student needs to be plugged in here. Um, but screening data, specifically your RDRS, like with all those great curriculum-based measures built into it, is a great place to start to weed out like where do we need to start with intervention and provide something that's matched to student need. All right. So I'm going to pause there before we kind of transition a little bit to talking more about like tier one. Um, how do we use screening data to evaluate tier one practices? And I want to just kind of ask the question. You can put in the chat if you want to come off mute and share. You are welcome to do that as well. But do folks have something like this or some similar guidance in your district for how to use screening data to start to identify which interventions students are placed into? Like, do you have a intervention menu or some sort of decision rules that looks something like this, or is this something new for you? So I'll pause there and you can add in the chat, or if you want to come off mute as well, you can do that. Or if you have a question, you can ask that now too. Yeah, it's a good question, Jennifer. Do you have a link to evidence-based curriculums? What I would do as a starting place, uh, NCII, National Center for Intensive Intervention, does have a intervention tools chart. So if you go to NCII and you click on at the top there, you'll see like tools chart link, and they have one for academic interventions. That will provide you a list of interventions that we have, or sorry, I wouldn't even say we. We have an independent group of experts that vet these, but they are evaluating the research and evidence behind those interventions. Now, the caveat thanks, Matt, for putting that link in there. The caveat that I tell people, because the tools chart is a bit controversial, and I'll tell you why, is that people go to that tools chart and they assume since it's on the tools chart that it's vetted, it's evidence based, and I can choose that and it's going to be great. That is not the case. Um, Publishers submit, and our panel evaluates the research. And we're not even evaluating the program, we're evaluating if the research is good behind it. So there is a way to kind of look through that and start to see, well, yeah, the research for this seems to be good. It gives like some logistics, like how many kids are in the group, how much time does it take if you want to like look at an intervention, like what might be feasible for you. It's a good place to start. But we typically tell people don't just go on there, look at something, and they're all rated by bubbles and say, oh, it's got like great bubbles, like let's get that. Because between you and me, there are things on that interventions chart that I particularly would not use. But again, it's evaluating the research behind it, the interventions, not the interventions themselves. But it's a great place to start. So, yeah. Yeah, Nicole, intuitive versus well planned out matrix. Yeah. Yeah. And the idea is like take some of the thinking out of it for teachers ahead of time. Not to say this is the end all be all. Like you're going to find some kids, you're going to go through this and say, well, that just doesn't seem like a good fit. We've got this other data that says they don't go here. Great. Like look at that other data. But this at least is a way to quickly say, okay, kids have this pattern of performance. We're typically going to need something like this. So if you don't have something like this, highly recommend starting to put together something. Again, I've seen them in flow charts as well. There's many different ways, but the idea is you want to have something that says when a student has this pattern of data, uh, they have this instructional need, and we will respond by providing this. So, yeah. All right. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about, we talked about how to identify students for tier two interventions, but I also want to talk about the other use of screening data is to start to look at tier one practices and examine like how effective is our core instruction. And so as we think about this triangle of supports here, we can start to see, well, what percentage of our kids are scoring at low risk, at some risk, at high risk? And we can start to see, is our support effective for students? Now, when kids come in very beginning of kindergarten, like you have no control over or very low control over what you get, right? Like if you come in with like reverse triangle, 90% of your kids in that high risk range, like that's what you get. Like you don't get to control that. You take them where they're at. But over time, right, we want to see that green range of those kids who are only needing tier one support. We want to see that grow. And we can use our screening data to do that. So if we start to look at our screening data and we say, well, in the fall, we've got 40% of kids who need tier one support, 25% who need tier two, and 35% who need tier three. We deliver our interventions, we deliver our program, and we start to see over time, like we're making positive growth. Like in the winter, we've increased that to 53%. In the spring, 62%. Like we are on our way towards that 80% of kids, right? We talked about ideally, you want your core to meet the needs of 80% of your students. So in this particular school, that's happening. And the nice thing here is we're not just increasing the number of kids who need only one tier one support to 62%. We're decreasing the number of kids who need that most intensive level of support, where that's down to 10%. And so this would be like positive growth. We would celebrate, yes, we're making growth. We're not at that 80%, but we are taking kids where they're at and we're moving them in the right direction. And if every grade level moves kids like this, like you're going to have close to 80% of your kids on track by like, third, fourth grade. And so, as we think about that, we want to have a process for reviewing data at tier one and evaluating like how are we doing as a grade level. And so I want to talk through this process, just a three-step process, fairly simple. We're trying to keep it kind of straightforward and simple, so it's more easy for teachers to kind of look at their data and do something with it. And so the process we're going to talk about is three steps. So the first is we're going to talk about how we look at basically just review screening data. Second step is we identify an instructional focus for our students. So what might we need to focus a little bit more time and effort on based on our data at tier one? And then we develop an instructional plan. And this is an iterative process. We want to do this ideally at each benchmarking period or each screening period. We would review our data, identify an instructional focus, and develop an instructional plan. And we would come back at the next benchmarking screening period and we would do the same thing. We'd say, okay, now where are we at? What's the new instructional focus, or do we have the same instructional focus? And what's our new plan? And so the first thing we do is really we just look at our screening data to start to determine what percentage of kids at tier one at this grade level do we have at low risk for reading difficulty. So who are those kids that only need tier one supports? Because again, we want to shoot for 80%. That's the goal. And we can use that as an overall indicator of how well our tier one supports are doing. And so we use that composite score again. We're not looking at the subtest score, but we're looking at that overall kind of composite or overall best indicator of kids who are on track for success. And we can start to look and say, well, we started in the fall at 46% students low risk, 34% some risk, and 20% at high risk. And in general, like we have this conversation at the grade level, like even if I'm a second grade teacher, like you get the kids you get. Like this is not a reflection of anything of your instruction, but like this just tells you this is where we're starting, and this is how we need to, provide support for the group of students that we have this year. Because those of you that have taught in the classroom know that some years you're going to get that class that comes in at like 40% of kids come in on track. Some years you're going to get that class where it's like 60%, 70%. Some years you get that class where 80% of kids come in on track because you just get that like really good class. That happens. And we need to be flexible in our core instruction to make sure that we're meeting the needs of the students that we have. Now, that doesn't mean we just deviate from the core curriculum, do our own thing. We still teach everything within that core, but we may need to do some parts a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on the group of students that we see in our classroom. And so recall the goal is to meet the needs of 80% of our students. And so you want to see like, how does your data compare and how does it change over time? Are we making progress or are we, going backwards? And so if I'm coming back in the winter and seeing, well, we implemented a plan, now we're at 54% of kids on track, still about the same percentage of kids in that high risk range. We went from 20 to 19, but we decreased the students in the some risk range. So progress. We've increased 8%. Now we may want to see more progress than that, but it's much better to start to see, that data go up than that data go down. Because data going up means forward growth for kids because the benchmarks change every screening period. You don't get to like read at the same level each benchmarking and stay on track. You have to keep going up. And so we want to make sure that our students are growing. So this doesn't mean that we, just the kids who are on track made growth, but this data would mean that some of those kids who were not on track are now on track, and will not require intervention support. So that's step one. And within step one, we also wanted to be thinking about how we look at patterns across our different student groups. And so you want to be thinking about like, how are we differentially meeting the needs of our students with disabilities, our multilingual learners, our students of color? We want to start to see who is our core instruction working for and who is our core instruction not working for. Because over time, we talk about this idea 80% is the goal, right? We want 80% of our students to be on track. But if I'm seeing like, yeah, we have 80% of our students on track, we're doing great. But what we're seeing is 80% of our students are on track because almost all of our white English speaking students are on track, but we're only meeting the needs of 40 to 50% of our Latino students. We're only meeting the needs of 30% of our kids with disabilities. Like that to me is not a fully effective core, at least not an equitable core. Like it's working for some kids the kids who it's historically worked for, but it's not working for all kids. So ideally, we want to get to a place where we can look at groups and start to see, is it meeting the needs of 80% of all of our student groups to be more of an equitable core instruction. And so we look at that data, we can break it down by student group and start to see like how do we need to change our core instruction to meet the needs of all of our students. And so that's step one. Step one is really just taking stock of like, this is where we're at, what percentage of kids are on track. At step two, we start to dig a little bit deeper and we ask that question, why? What are those skills that our students at tier one are most of our students or many of our students, what are those skills that they are lacking or that seem to be bottlenecking them from becoming proficient readers? And so we think about this idea of like reading is based on foundational skills, but like there's some amount of sequentialness to reading, right? You have to have some earlier skills before you develop later skills. And so, like we have to, based on this chart, like we have to develop basic print concepts. We have to understand basic phonological awareness. So you have to understand that language is made up of sounds and that those sounds can be broken down and mapped onto written language. Once we know that word language is made up of sounds, we can start to map on to which letters and letter combinations that is. So first, I have to be able to hear the b sound in bat, and then I have to know that the b sound maps onto the b, and the b looks like this, and this is how I write it, right? And then that allows me to start blending those sounds together. That allows me to know if b is the b, a is the a, is the T, I can start to see those three letters together and put them together. So that allows me to decode words, which then allows me, as I decode more and more words, I orthographically map those into my memory so I don't have to decode them every time and I can read them automatically. And so the idea is like we build skill by skill to having proficient readers. And so as we look at our screening data, we can start to see, well, what are the skills that many of our kids seem to be lacking right now that are preventing them from becoming proficient readers? And so if we go back to this idea of looking at instructional focus, again, you have all these individual subtests where we can start to see, like looking in columns, are what percentage of our kids are proficient on letter naming fluency? What percentage of our kids are meeting the benchmark on phoneme segmentation fluency? Where does the breakdown seem to be occurring for a lot of our students? What percentage of kids are at low risk on each of these individual measures? And so, as we have, like, if 80% of our kids are proficient on some of these measures, that would tell me tier one instruction is doing pretty well with that, right? It's meeting the needs of this skill for most kids. And those kids that don't have that skill, we can provide interventions for. But if 50% of your kids aren't meeting a phoneme segmentation fluency measure, like your tier one is not effective in that. And you cannot provide interventions, nor should you provide interventions to each and every kid if you have half your kids that need that. That is a tier one core instructional issue. And so we start to look across and we start to see, the next slide here. Is there a particular skill area that many or most students need that is impacting the development of skills? And so as we look, maybe this is what our data says. We see 85% of our kids are meeting the benchmark in letter naming fluency, 76% are meeting it in phoneme segmentation fluency, 76% can identify basic letter sounds based on the nonsense word fluency, and then it drops off. We have about 57%, meaning a little over half of our kids can decode or blend simple letter sounds into simple CVC words, which is most likely impacting less kids who can decode accurately on a fluency passage, and less of them are reading fluency. And so overall reading proficiency is at about 54%. And so if I look at this, I start to see here's the bottleneck. And so I would think at tier one, if we can improve basic phonics skills, if we can do a better job of helping kids go from this basic letter sounds to blending, they're going to be able to read more accurately in text. They're going to be able to read more fluently in text, and they're going to be able to comprehend. And so this is to where like I could like try to give more comprehension, but that's not going to help my kids. Like most of your kids need this basic, need to make this jump, or half of your kids need to. These three skills, like these three foundational skills here, you can provide interventions for that roughly 20% of kids that need that, or small group instruction. Like here, this is a whole group instruction issue. Like we need to do something differently in our curriculum. And it may be like a wide range of things. And we're going to talk about like different ways that we can address this. But Whereas step one was looking at this overall proficiency, step two is digging deeper to see, well, why do we have that overall proficiency? What are the skills that we need to lean a little bit more into right now for this particular group of students? Right. So, what that's going to allow us to do then is to develop an instructional plan at step three that's going to help us target that specific need for all of our students, or at least most of our students. And so, at step three, we're going to start by reviewing prior instruction to see, what impact did our previous instruction have on student screening data. So if we've tried strategies in the past, did they work? Did they not work? But we want to be reflective of the things that we've done to draw on the strengths and the things that have worked. And then we really want to choose 1 to 2 strategies that can strengthen the teaching of that focus skill, of that area of need that we have identified that many or most kids will need. And we talk about these 3 areas of instruction, curriculum, and environment. And so the idea is, are there instructional strategies that we can all agree as a grade level to use consistently? Are there specific curriculum materials that we need to use a little bit more or use differently? And are there environmental strategies that we can use to support our students that they currently need? And so I say, like in general, you want to choose 1 to 2 things, and to be honest, not much more than that. And I'll talk about why. But we want to kind of lean in and start to see, well, what instructional strategies um, can we use? What curriculum materials might be used, and what environmental strategies. And so I find it helpful to have a list of things for teachers to choose from, because it's always hard to kind of just come up with things on their own as teachers are having conversation. And if we just like develop plans without something to look at, some evidence-based strategies, we typically tend to do the things that we're most comfortable with, that may not be the most effective things. And so possible strategies maybe, well, maybe we need to give kids more opportunities to respond because our curriculum doesn't have a lot of practice for kids. We need to build in more practice. Maybe we need to give more feedback because we're not really good at giving immediate feedback. Kids make errors, there's no error correction procedure, so kids just practice errors. Maybe it's more modeling. So maybe your teacher's curriculum tells you model it once for kids and then have them do it. Well, it's not working for your kids, so you're going to need to build in more modeling. You like model a little bit more, provide some guided practice. Maybe manipulatives. Maybe we're using Elkonin boxes. Maybe you're using whiteboards more. Maybe it's something that we need to make it more tangible for kids. Like that's especially helpful when kids are going from like understanding sounds to like writing or understanding the written word. Like having them write it or having like markers can be helpful. So those are like some instructional strategies we could choose from. Curriculum materials. We could think about, well, what materials do we already have in our curriculum that we could use to leverage this? So, for example, like if we've got, like we know our kids are not doing well at decoding, basic decoding, maybe we have a word work activity that like we need to do more of that. Like it says do it for 5 minutes, we need to do it for more because our kids are not getting it. Maybe it's the decodable books. Maybe you haven't used those. Maybe we need to use those. Maybe there's sound spelling cards that we could use. But I would encourage you before you think about like supplementing and going outside and seeing what else can we get. Like oftentimes there's good things in your core curriculum that maybe you haven't used or haven't used as much as it could be used. As you know, those reading core curriculum, especially like there's a lot of things in there. And so just what I'm saying is like look inside the box before you start like thinking outside the box because there's a lot of things that you could use. And then environmental strategies, that's where we start to think about like, do we need to manage the classroom a little bit more effectively? And so, as we know, like classroom management is critical for getting kids to engage in instruction. Like the first, like the we think about like the learning sequence, the first step in learning anything is we have to attend to it. We have to pay attention. You're not going to learn anything if you're not paying attention. And so sometimes it's hard to get kids' attention, right? And so maybe we need to do a better job of just making sure all the kids are engaged in classroom work. So it's like, do we need to teach and reteach the expectations for how we learn in class? Do we need to teach or reteach specific routines? Do we need more positive reinforcement? Maybe it's transition times. Maybe you're losing 10 minutes of class time when kids are coming in and going out, that we could use that class time or repurpose it. Something like that. But the idea is like this provides a list of like things for teachers to start to choose from to start to address that focus skill a little bit more with the idea of like if we do these things to address this focus skill, we should see growth. And so an example might be like if our instructional focus skill, we've identified that basic phonics, like kids know letter sounds, but they're not blending. Maybe we say, well, we're going to increase opportunities to respond by providing individual and partner responses during the word work activity. So we've got a blending activity. We're going to give more individual turns for kids. And we're going to do partner responses because our curriculum has told us like you ask a question, ask a student to blend a word, and you call on one student at a time. And we know that is not an effective instructional strategy. So we're going to do partners. We're going to set up a routine and we're going to have kids tell their partner. And so we're also going to build in a partner activity with decodable text. So simple decodable text, we're going to teach kids a little activity about one kid's going to be a reader, the other kid's going to follow along. And that's going to give them more practice decoding words, basic words in text. And for the curriculum materials, we're going to use blending boards. So maybe our curriculum comes with those. Maybe we've just got whiteboards that we're going to use for that. And we've got decodable books that we're going to use. Environmental strategy is just that partner routine. We want to teach kids to do that partner routine with those decodable books. So they're going to get more opportunities to read words, both with that blending activity and then practice those words again in those decodable books. So that may be our grade level plan. Nothing more, like you don't need to change your entire reading block, but we know we are targeting that need that kids have for basic decoding skills by doing this particular thing a little bit better. And we agree as a grade level team to do this together. This is not like I'm going to do this and you're going to do that as a grade level team. It's we're going to do this together because there's power in numbers. Like we're going to do this consistently. We're going to learn from each other. Maybe we're going to like observe in a different classroom to see how it's going. But the idea is primarily we're trying to increase student reading outcomes, but we're also trying to increase teachers' capacity to really implement effective practices. I want teachers to learn new things, to get new strategies, get new tools in their tool belt through this. And so we develop a plan together as a grade level team, and we are all going to commit to implementing that for this benchmarking period because we're going to come back at the next screening period and we're going to say we did this routine where we're increasing opportunity to respond with the decodable routine. We're going to come back and I anticipate that that's going to improve our percentage of our kids who are now decoding simple words. And if it did, great. We celebrate that. We know that we impacted that. And where we put our effort, we saw outcomes. If it didn't work, we're going to say, well, that wasn't the thing. Like, we need to try something differently. As long as we actually implemented it, right? Like, if we come back and no one actually did it, then that's a problem. But we want to make sure that we're implementing something together and seeing the effect of it. So when we develop that instructional plan, we encourage people not just to develop the plan, but also think about how you're going to support and monitor that plan. And so the idea of like, maybe I don't know what the decodable routine is, and so we need training on it. Like we need someone to come in and show us what that routine might look like and model that in our classrooms. Maybe it's like one of our teachers does it really well. We're all going to go to her classroom. We're going to watch that. We're going to learn about it, and then we're going to do it in our own classroom. But we need some way to support that after the fact. We also want to measure fidelity, like, are we actually doing it? With the idea, like, I'm not trying to catch teachers and say, aha, you're not doing it. Like, that's not the point. The point is, like, we want to come back in, like, at the next screening and know if our plan worked. And to do that, we have to know that we actually implemented the plan. And so, are we going to do walkthroughs? Are we going to do, like, self report checklists, student work samples? This can be like, really helpful for things like when we think about like principal walkthroughs. Because if I know like my second grade team is working on this routine to support this data, like I don't want to go in, I don't need to go in and look at everything under the sun. I want to look at how are you doing with this routine? How can I help you with this particular routine? It should create focus in what we're looking for by developing a plan that's matched to the data that we're seeing. And then decide how to measure outcomes. So, yes, you're going to come back at the next screening period and you're going to measure. Did it work on the next benchmarking data? But you might have more interim assessments that you want to take a look at, like are kids responding more accurately? If you have unit assessments or little checkouts or spelling tests, like are kids getting better at those tests? We want to see that happening as well because we don't want to necessarily wait to the next benchmarking period. All right. So a couple tips for like this data review practice, this tier one data review process. One, first and foremost, choose strategies that are clearly matched to the instructional focus. So again, for example, like if we're teaching like basic decoding skills, that's the focus. Like that's going to require more like modeling and explicit instruction from the teacher in terms and not necessarily just like independent work. Like I'm not going to say like all right, kids need to blend words better. Let's just give them more worksheets. Like that's not gonna like be matched to what they need. Versus like if they really just need to work on fluency, like I don't need to do more teaching. Like we need to set routines up for kids to practice. So make sure it's matched to the specific skill that you're teaching. Number two, this is a really important one, and this is I find myself saying this more and more lately, but the idea is simple plans, relentless implementation. Your plans do not have to have and shouldn't be like, 5, 6, 7, 10 steps long. I think we've gotten to this place where we've have this idea that the longer and more complex our plan is, the better it is. But the longer and more complex your plan is, just the more likely it's probably not going to happen with fidelity. So choose a few things that are high leverage practices. Things like increase opportunities to respond, increase practice, give feedback, build positive relationships, set up routines, like do a few things and do them really, really well and just follow up on them. Um, Number three, revisit those plans before the next screening period if you can. Like, there's nothing worse than everyone coming together to have this conversation and talking about how we use screening data. And then everyone goes their own way, and you come back in the next screening period, and everyone's like, well, what was the plan? I never did that. And so maybe you're following up in your monthly PLCs to talk about the plan. How's it going? Again, maybe it's principal walkthroughs, ongoing coaching, but revisit those as much as possible. And then make sure teacher voice drives the creation of those tier one plans. Literacy specialists, administrators should definitely help those conversations and help drive those, but you can't tell teachers what their plan should be. That's a bad idea. Like teachers need to have ownership of that and come up with those strategies as a team. And so you can guide them to the right things to make sure they're picking things that are going to work, but I would never choose a plan for a group of teachers. I would want them to choose it, and I can help support it. So, all right. A couple more things. I know we're kind of almost out of time here. Just some resources here. These are in the slides, but you do want to share this data with families. We know, based especially on like the California guidance, there's a few things that you have to share with families. As much as possible, make sure that you're sharing results in a family-friendly language, no jargon, and let them know like what score is considered on track. Like I think we give kid like, and I like my school does this, my kid's school does this sometimes, and I know what scores are, so I can interpret it. But they just said, well, your kid like had 27 letter sounds correct. It's like, okay, like is that good? Is that bad? Like I don't know. Make sure it's clear like what is the benchmark and where they need to be. But also like some next steps, like is there reading support that you're going to provide? If you're going to provide interventions, what can families provide at home? How can parents reach out and ask questions? And so we've got a couple NCI resources here, for families specifically, like some questions that families can ask or things to look for. These are helpful resources for families to think about. All right. So as you think about next steps, just think about like, what are they? Like, do you need to learn more about your scores that your screener provides and what the instructional need is that they're measuring? Do you need to develop a placement protocol for how we match kids to interventions? Maybe you want to start that tier one data process. And I realize we have an agenda through the MTSS Center that guides that. I realize I didn't put that in the folder, but as we hop off here, I will drop that in the folder so you can have our 2-page agenda to walk through as a resource. And maybe you need to develop a system for communicating with families. Two other resources for you. These are linked in here, but the California frequently asked questions for the RDRS really is quite good. Like they do answer a lot of good questions. So continue to go back to there if you have questions. I did want to share this other resource from Regional Education Labs through IES. They have a resource for kindergarten, for first grade and second grade. Basically, it's kind of what I shared with that placement protocol. It tells you if kids are low on these measures or high on these measures, what their instructional need is, and then it gives you actually some free activities that are linked, some videos that you can use to help teach that instructional need. So if you don't have intervention, so just a nice resource to help you build those decision rules for kids in need of interventions. Again, there's a kindergarten, first grade, and a second grade version there. So that is linked on the slides. But I will also drop in the tier one resource in the Google Drive as well. So, all right. I told you there's a lot in this one today. So, hour and 15 minutes talking about how to use screening data. There's a lot of uses for screening data if we start to dig in. But um, as we kind of, I know we're at times, if you have to hop off, you can hop off. But I did want to just hang on for a second. If folks do have questions or anything they wanted to add, now is the time to hop in.
Well, we just want to thank everybody so much for joining us this afternoon. That was amazing. As always, the content was so clear and really actionable. Really loved the part about looking at the data and not just for intervention, but also decisions that we make in tier one. So just really appreciate you taking that time. And I definitely want to make a poster of simple plans, relentless implementation. Make a big poster of that. That was perfect. Looks like we have a question from Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm in an organization that actually it's a Montessori public funded charter school. And I've noticed I've been here about a year now, and I've noticed that they are not they're not using evidence-based tier one instruction. They're using materials aligned with Montessori, not to say that the Montessori curriculum can't encompass, right, those areas. However, it's it's very random and it's hit or miss in terms of which components they're teaching. Um, and so I guess my question to you is, given that the situation, like where would be the best starting point in your perspective with an organization that hasn't quite understood the fact that we need a solid tier one instruction that's evidence based? You know what I mean? Like, because I feel like, and we do have evidence that there are teachers that are only teaching maybe 10% of reading here and there. You know what I mean? It's kind of that sort of old school Montessori mentality of like follow the child and follow
Yeah,
what they're interested in, but it's harming students. I think the self-selected families where the children are already high performing, that it's not an issue, but because some of our scores certainly do paint a picture of kids performing really high. But when you dig into those subgroups and you dig into the kinder, first grade, second grade, pre-CAS scores, it's painting a very different picture.
yeah.
So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, I appreciate Nancy's comment or question in there about using one of the four screeners. Do you currently use one of the RDRS screeners or using one of those or going to?
Yes, yes. So our district has adopted the Dibbles Amplify,
Okay,
and
great.
so and actually I'm actually assisting. We have a director of just Montessori because we're a Montessori charter, working with her on actually developing a flow chart, kind of what you were saying, like sort of
Mhm.
using the data and then what? Like you get these scores, then what? You know, and so she's been really receptive to that. But I think still the big elephant in the room is how do we get teachers teaching tier one? And for example, I had a meeting today with the reading specialist at one of our campuses, and she said she has a caseload of 70 students. Because, for example, the teachers in first grade, if the students still don't know their letter names and sounds, boom, they're automatically referring them to the reading specialist.
Yeah,
So there's no like real there's not there's a lack of accountability, right? That's a bigger conceptual issue,
Yeah.
but I feel like that is the big piece is that they're not, and so maybe that's just where we start is with the dyslexia screener, the amplify, and just
Yeah.
start looking at their scores as a whole and then saying, okay, so like putting it back on them. Okay, so now what? How are we going to increase their, because they can't all, so essentially the reading specialist is doing the tier one instruction for any kid that's
Yeah.
not at level,
Can I make a comment about that, Jennifer? And
Yeah.
that is that I would refrain from using the language that it's a dyslexia screener because part of the messaging that this statewide ELA bodies are trying to message is that it's a screener for to find out who's at risk, right? And it
Yeah.
is to inform tier one. So when we label it dyslexia, then we're saying it belongs over there somewhere else. So just
Got
be
it.
mindful.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I mean, sometimes having that data is helpful, and that's why we talk about that tier one conversation because it's the forest from the trees conversation, right? Like if you're going kid by kid, it's really easy to blame the kid and say, oh, well, this kid's not getting it, that kid. But if you start to see that big data, it's like, holy moly, like we got a forest fire here. Like this is not a kid issue, like this is an us issue, and starting to use data, like we use data a lot as a window into kids. We need to use it more as a mirror reflecting like what we're kind of looking at. And so I think it's starting to look at that data and starting to have like real honest conversations about, excuse me, you're not going to intervene your way out of that. And it's, I use the analogy a lot, excuse me, just the health analogy of like we know like interventions are helpful, but interventions are a supplement. And so like think about like if you went to your doctor and they told you your blood pressure's high, like you need to exercise 30 minutes a day. Great. I'm going to go home. I exercise 30 minutes a day religiously. But what I don't do is
Mhm.
I don't change my lifestyle, I don't change my diet, I don't do anything else the other 23 and a half. Like that 30 minutes a day is not going to change your outcomes. You need a
Mhm.
lifestyle change. But that's what we do with kids when we just farm out to like, oh, we'll send them to intervention. Like, and to some extent, I think special ed created this to some extent, and the MTSS, I think, has made it a bit worse that we still have this mentality that kids get fixed somewhere else. And the best
Mhm.
way to address kids who are at risk of reading difficulties is high quality tier one instruction that prevents most kids from needing tier one. That doesn't mean
Mhm.
every kid gets the exact same thing. There should be a mix of whole group and small group. You still differentiate. I mean, everything I
Mhm.
talked about with that placement protocol, identifying instructional need, you should also identify instructional need for small group instruction within tier one. But when you start to see the big patterns of data, um, it starts to
Mhm.
be eye-opening around like we need to do something differently in tier one.